So welcome to another Wind Down Wednesday at Barry Island Books and Art in Stone Harbor, New Jersey. It's volume 7. If you haven't seen our earlier editions, please do. It is Wind Down Wednesday, where we like to talk about the store, and then we talk about other things as it relates to books, and then we, of course, then feature a book, and tonight is the Fahrenheit 451 episode. We're going to get to that a little bit later. But along the lines of that, this is recycle, reuse, reread. Being a used bookstore, our goal is to keep books out of the trash, to keep them read, to keep them relevant, to keep them be a part of our history. So we go out and try to find you the books that relate to your lives and the things that you talk to us about. We're not a new bookstore, we're not a library, we're not a museum. We're trying to create something in between all that interacts with your lives and books. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit here. But recycle, reuse, reread. And along those lines, we do take trade-ins as well as our own purchasing. And that's another way to save a book. If you're done with it, we have a little credit box. We give you as much credit as we can. We can't always take all the books, and we'll kindly let you know that we can't take that. It's a very small store. If I had a bigger store, like a big barn in PA, we could take a lot more. But come talk to us about it sometime. A lot of locals have their name and some credit kept in a box, and then they or their families can come in and shop with the credit. We ship books, so if there's anything we talk about here tonight, we ship media rate through the U.S. Postal Service. And, of course, all your social media, like us and love us. You can always check out all our Instagram pictures and posts going back the last year. You'll see a lot of neat, interesting quotes about the world of books. And we are also found on these book chats. If somebody that wants to see it, but they're not on Facebook, they can always go to YouTube. And then again, interact with us on Facebook, especially if you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns. And moving on to page 2 of my little notes here. We usually start off the show by talking about the back wall a little bit. And I'm going to feature a few things. We have this side here is usually our collectible kids books. That are not the picture books, but smaller books. We have the Lemony Snicket series for people who like to either go back and reread them or decorate. We have a lot of Nancy Drew, especially when they have ships or lighthouses on the cover. They make for good decor. We've got the Hardy Boys. We've got the Great Illustrated Classics. And oddly enough, last week, of course, we talked about the Modern Library series and how I had come across The Plague by Albert Camus. And I looked it up this week, and I didn't realize what a popular book that was. And this is a big seller right now in the used book world. And a complete opposite direction, we do have a lot of Zane Grey and Westerns and history in small book size. And then later issues, we're going to go down to that end of the book wall. In the very corner is where we keep our classics, and we've got a lot to talk about there, of course. When we move over to the chair for the book chat, I just want to talk a little bit about that. We're very repetitive sometimes in a subject matter. And, of course, if that's not your favorite subject, or maybe you're not your favorite author or book, of course, that could be a little disheartening. And when it gets to the second or third time we talked about something, but I'm trying to string some things together, trying to string together some thought and process. And, of course, the pandemic has been on people's minds as it's one of the most important events we've had in the last 100 years in this country. And we talked about it from different directions. We've talked about maybe reading a classic to get away from it, reading a destination mystery book to take your mind away from it. We've talked about history, the history of the pandemic, how other leaders have led America through tough times. To know your past from history helps you deal with today and help better predict your future. We've talked about science. We've talked about a lot about Rachel Carson. We went on for a couple episodes. Science gives us the information of maybe how this pandemic and the virus work, how it possibly came from bats, how humans are encroaching into the natural world, and that interaction is causing more situations like the one we're in. And we talked about books that we have in here that have been written about the pandemic, both nonfiction and fiction, like Stephen King's The Stand. And the last two episodes, we've talked about propaganda. How are you getting your news? So obviously, with this pandemic, the information you get is very important. And what these two authors, last week's George Orwell and this week's Ray Bradbury, are trying to tell us is learn for yourself, take in your own information, educate yourself, so then you know better how to apply that to not only the pandemic, but your government, news media, where you're getting your information from. And tonight, we're going to talk about probably the most important book written along those lines, as well as last week's 1984. And it also combines with how we started off about recycle, reuse, reread, and trying to save books, keep them current, keep them in people's hands. And it's Fahrenheit 451, and we're going to go over in a corner and talk about it. So it can't be a Bayside Book Chat without talking about FDR, and we usually throw you a few quotes, so I'm going to go right to it. FDR said, men are not prisoners of fate, but prisoners of their own minds. FDR also said, democracy alone of all forms of government enlists the full force of men's enlightened will. And these are quotes about using your mind in education, and that applies to the books we've talked about the last 2 weeks, so we thought we'd throw those in there. And then since we're talking about Ray Bradbury and his wine night, he wrote a book that I have not read, that I actually, doing this work, I've decided it's something that I must read sooner than later, maybe this summer, because the book is about the summertime. It was written in 1957, but it was set in the summer of 1928 in Illinois, and it was based upon Bradbury's childhood. And so this is off of Wikipedia. The title refers to a wine made with dandelion petals and other ingredients, commonly citrus fruit. So I have Fred's, who I buy my wine from before these episodes, did not have a dandelion wine. I imagine that's harder to find. This summer, I would imagine some of these local wineries around here might make it, and I'll have to track a bottle down. But for this show, I couldn't track one down, so I just went with a Pinot Grigio, something light and fruity, which they're referring to here. But in the story, dandelion wine is made by the protagonist's grandfather, serves as a metaphor for packing all of the joys of summer into a single bottle. The main character of the story is Douglas Spaulding, a 12-year-old boy loosely patterned after Bradbury. Most of the book is focused upon routines of small-town America and the simple joys of yesterday. And doing research on the book, it just seemed to show that there was a lot of thought towards life and how to live it. So some quotes from Bradbury that are from the book or about it. A good night's sleep, or a 10-minute brawl, or a pint of chocolate ice cream, or all three together, is good medicine. Separate quote. Bees do have a smell, you know, and if they don't, they should, for their feet are dusted with the spices from a million flowers. And about life, the first thing you learn in life is you're a fool. So it's a great book about life that I'd like to read, but he's most famous for Fahrenheit 451, and we're going to get into that. Welcome back. I need a little sip before we start getting into this heavy stuff. So before we start talking about the book and the plot and the characters, as we talked about before, you know, if you know the history of something, you're better able to understand it and move forward with it. So we're going to talk about book burning. So Orwell and Bradbury both stressed individual thought is necessary to defend against governmental thought control and propaganda. And it wasn't just created ideas in their head. These were observations that stuck in them because of their own observations that they witnessed. And what they witnessed in the early 1900s was a very fascist Germany and a very totalitarian and Stalinist on going towards communist Russia. And they witnessed this firsthand. In these books, or not only talking about it in a sense, but trying to steer us to be observant of when we see these things and to be prepared to use our own thought and our own minds to stop it. So they were against totalitarianism. Again, that big word I struggle with. And today's big three, and this is just my opinion, are North Korea, China, and Russia. And they are countries that when you think about them, some of the first things that come to your mind are a people not being free to express themselves. How do you get your news in those countries? Are they monitoring your email? Are things being deleted and erased? Do reporters go missing or jailed? Or sometimes purposely known to be dead to make a statement so that it leaves an impression on others. So these are currently three countries that fall into what these books are talking about. And something that upsets me is for a long time in this country, we took a stand as a nation against them. So here's a little bit of something that I picked up on lately, and this is a little advice that I could give to current leadership, which is, we don't need to be having love letters with Kim Jong-un. And how good of a friendship is it with President Xi of China if now we're blaming him for not getting information, and in the beginning saying what a great friendship it is that I trust him. And there's no place for any American president to stand on a stage in Helsinki and take sides with a Russian dictator over our own intelligence. That's me. So getting back to the beginnings of things, what Orwell and Bradbury saw was within Nazism, they had a lot of book burnings. And we're going to show you a couple of clips that are photographs of that time period just to be still in the moment. Sometimes visual things strike a real chord. They were real things that happened. And then this week, instead of doing our PBS 10, we'll continue that in a future episode, we're going to talk about 10 of the most challenged books that Time Magazine compiled. And challenged doesn't mean that they were all burned, although one or two of them were. It means that they were fought against. Maybe a school board pulled them. They were talked about in a negative way. They were challenged, which in some things in life, things should be challenged. And but I'm going to read you off what Time Magazine put together as the top 10. And there's a lot of other lists out there, but I just picked one. And we're going to go forward with that. So first up, and they're all for different reasons. The Hunger Games was considered by Time Magazine to be a very challenged book because a lot of people considered it to have very negative aspects towards family structure and one or two other things in it, but it was very anti-family. Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, but primarily Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain, and that had mostly to do with language at the time that it was written. They thought the language was a little too loose. Nabokov, Lolita, rough word, pedophilia. So for obvious reasons there. The Anarchist Cookbook. Don't have a copy, and when I read about it, I don't know if I'm going to go seeking the copy. Candide was a French satirical classic, and I guess some people maybe in French society didn't care for getting much fun made of them. 1984, of course, we've talked about in last week's issue. And we also have The Catcher in the Rye, which when John Lennon was shot, and who shot Lennon, handed the book to the police and said that had maybe inspired him to do it. And then getting back to book burning, in Maine in 2001, a group of parents got together, and they burned Harry Potter, and they considered it to have too much witchcraft, wizardry, and I guess satanic elements to it. So Harry Potter was part of a book burning. So another little tidbit about challenged books before we move on to 451. In 1973, and this is an author that I've got three loyal customers who are very into him. We may talk about him specifically in a future issue. I try to collect a lot of copies on him, and it's Kurt Vonnegut. And in 1973, a high school in North Dakota had a book burning which included Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-5. And after finding out about it, Vonnegut sent a letter to the school board. And I read a good portion of it. It's too long to get into here. But, you know, in this day and age with the internet and Google, do yourself a favor and, you know, Google 1973 North Dakota Kurt Vonnegut Slaughterhouse-5 and read the article that Kurt Vonnegut said in response. So, Fahrenheit 451. I read it in college. I read 1984 in college. I hope to find time in the near future to reread them. Obviously, in the last 2 weeks, I've learned a lot about him, and it's kind of re-inspired me. Ray Bradbury, when we talked about Orwell and Bradbury and the reasons why they have written these books, but, you know, in last week's episode, we did have a quote from Ray Bradbury that says, "I don't try to describe the future, you know, I try to prevent it." And again, we talked about about mindset. They're trying to give us, remind us to have the ability to think for ourselves. And again, Bradbury had seen what propaganda had occurred in the early 1900s, but something that occurred in the mid 1900s was how he inspired this book more directly, which was that he saw how radio and television, as it crept into society, was replacing books. So the message of the book was twofold. One, it was, let's not forget about books and their importance in history and how they record history, but also if they're put aside and radio and television are coming more into play, he felt that governments and propagandists would have a better forum with that to get into our minds. And of course, today, if he were around, maybe he would say the same in regards to the internet. And a common example of that would be, of course, in the last election, how we've heard about how Russians and bots were getting into our Facebook and our mass media and messaging, and, you know, putting little things in there that maybe we weren't picking up on. So I think today he would have been making mention of that. As for the book itself and the plot and the characters, just like 1984, I encourage you to go read the book. I'll talk a little bit about it. And again, after you've read it, think about it, and then engage yourself with maybe some of the booktubers that I've mentioned before, like the literary gladiators and people who have book discussions. But for what I do here with our bookstore, I'm not going to take a book and then read you the whole plot and then give you, you know, a 10-minute dissertation on what I think everything meant. I think it's more important about how you feel about it. I remember when I was in high school, I had one teacher that we went back and read a lot of the Victorian and English classics, and every time I felt like I gave a report on the book, it was always wrong because it was what people were telling you were supposed to answer about the book rather than your own impressions you got from it. So I want you to read it for yourselves, get your own impressions. But, you know, a short synopsis of the book is that the main character, Montag, is a fireman. And basically what happened was, in this dystopian future society, they were able to build houses so well that they didn't need the firemen that much anymore. So they felt the government needed to give them a different purpose, which was to burn houses down of people who were hoarding books. So the main character starts off as a fireman, but in the course of doing his job, he starts to suspect that maybe this isn't the best way, and he himself starts to take a couple of books and grab them and hoard them for himself and try to start reading them and learn about them and then start to engage a couple of his close friends into the plot. And the police or the fire chief starts to catch on to these antics, and then the story goes from there. And I suggest you read it and follow up on it and think about it. All right, it's time for some trivia. And we got to review something. 2 episodes ago, I guess, on the Bayside, when we went to the Delaware Bay, we filmed this, not tonight, actually tonight is Wednesday, but many of the episodes we do the night before. And so I said my brother Mike had got 9 out of 10 and was the winner, but between that time and the next day, I got someone who sent me 10 out of 10. So my brother Mike did not win that week. Jody Miner did. She got 10 out of 10, and the difference maker was a little bit of local knowledge. You had to know what fish bites when the gnats start biting and the dogwood blooms. My brother Mike, living in Connecticut, just guessed weakfish, but Jody Miner knew that it was the black drum. Another correction is that last week, unless I'm missing something, I might have only asked 9 questions. It was supposed to be 10. But what I got is, what was the first dystopian novel aimed at young adults? And that was The Giver. What was the name of the antagonistic pig in Orwell's Animal Farm? That was Napoleon. The name of the 2 tribal leaders from Lord of the Flies were Ralph and Roger. The name of the movie, that's the Mad Max sequel that starred Tina Turner, was Beyond Thunderdome. The book 1984, in a way, was a response to Stalin. What does 451 refer to in Fahrenheit 451? That is the temperature that books burn at. In 1984, Who's Watching You? That's Big Brother. The drug that they all took in A Brave New World is Soma. And the character Offred, Offred, was from The Handmaid's Tale. And that leads us to this week, where we're going to again play the video of Mad Max to lead you into these dystopian questions. That's one of my favorite movie clips. Crazy movie. And Charlize Theron is excellent in it. Questions for this week are, and there's a few in it from it, but starting off with another one of my favorite movies, Blade Runner is based on writings that were titled Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Who was the famous sci-fi writer who inspired Blade Runner? In Blade Runner, the character Deckard in the 1982 film was played by a very famous actor. Who was it? In Mad Max Road Warrior, the early episodes, was played by a very famous actor. Who was that? What, in this dystopian futuristic movie, what country was it set in? In the later sequel, Fury Road, what very famous actress played the lead part? And then moving on from dystopia to a little bit about mind and intelligence, because we already talked about how Orwell and Bradbury were trying to inspire self-thought. What is the largest and oldest IQ society in the world? Question 7 is, what is the largest library in the United States? Question 8 is, what is the oldest American college, founded in 1636? H.G. Wells, Aldous Huxley, Ray Bradbury, and George Orwell all hailed from what country? And we talked about dystopian novels. What is an imagined place or state where everything is perfect, unlike dystopian? So before we do our toast, I'm going to give you a little insight in what we're going to be talking about in the next coming volumes of Bayside Book Chats. And we're going to try to lighten things up a little bit. There's a lot of books in the store from a lot of different categories. We talked about all the different avenues that we've taken to talk about this pandemic. But now we're going to talk about how to deal with it in these ways. How to deal with, the stress of it. How financially and economically this country is going to move forward. Some books about sociology and again, maybe a little bit of social science along those lines. We have some books in here about loss and hope. Maybe you feel, depressed or stressed, or you've had a family member who is ill or has passed away. How do you deal with that? We have a lot of spiritual books in the store, both religious and non-religious, that help you with mind, body, soul, and spirit, to give yourself a little bit of a grounding and how to move forward. And sometimes, the best thing is laughter. And we have books in here from comedians and a little bit of humor. So we're going to try to lighten things up and move forward. And hopefully this bookstore can help you. So here's a toast with my fake dandelion wine. Maybe in a future episode we'll track down, or maybe I'll make some myself. I've got dandelions in my yard, who knows. But we always like to do a toast. And as usual, we do talk about the people in, the front lines and the heroes. I myself have just returned to full-time work at Hoy's, and it's given me this past week, a viewpoint into what people have been dealing with the last couple months who work at, again, your Acme and your CVS and your stores. And so something I'd like to say is to everyone, when you're going into these stores, please be observant of the rules that the stores put in place, and keep in mind the stress level that these employees are under. And a good way to help them would be, to shop with your eyes and not with your hands. Obviously, the less things we touch, the better. If you've got little ones with you, keep them tight to you. Don't let them run all over the store and, touch things. So again, we love the mom and pops and appreciate all that you do. Keep them in mind and shop wisely. Shop small. And till next time, in Volume 8, take care.